They woke me at dawn with a cold sigil pressed to my forehead, and the air smelled of ozone and candle wax. Every sound was exaggerated, as if the world itself was listening. Being drafted as a Psyker was not a promise of power. It was a sentence where the first act was learning whether your mind would save others or burn everything. I was about to find out which I am. I had been shoved from sleep before the sun touched the barracks roof. My blanket fell in a heap. Wood creaked under half-asleep bodies. Somewhere a kettle began to sing like a far-off alarm. Two men in plain gray grabbed my arms and didn't bother to ask my name. One of them left a smear of cold wax on my brow, pressed into a faint ring the size of a coin. The wax cooled quicker than their patience. They called it a sigil. They called me subject. The words meant less than the pressure of fingers. The muster hall smelled of ink and wet wool and the same wax that had been warmed against my skin. Ranks of faces turned toward us as we passed. Some were stitched with fatigue. Some held hope like a thin, brittle shield. An old woman near the drafting table made a sound that could have been a prayer. A boy 2 beds down spat and looked away, too practiced in keeping his face blank to show fear. I learned the language of the room then, how people tightened their shoulders, how eyes flicked to the stamped forehead. What it meant when the clerks made a small, fast notation beside a name. The stamp made me belong to something I had never asked for. They walked me down a corridor lit by gutters of candlelight, the drips hissing as they fell. The light made everything closer, smaller. Shadows grew long and hungry. The wax on my forehead still tasted metallic when I touched it with my tongue. The 2 men kept their voices low, like men who had been taught to keep certain things from being heard. One of them, a thin-faced sergeant with a voice like gravel, told me there was no glory in being marked. He said there was only the duty. He said in a way that tried to be careful that some minds were terrors without knowing. He said the tests would tell us which kind you were. They led me into the testing hall, a room whose door sighed like it had been closed for centuries. A ring of candles stood in the center, their light steadier than any I had seen. The examiners wore masks that obscured their mouths. The mouths of the masks were thin slits that made them look like fish. One of them took a small device from a table, brass and glass, and set it near my hand. It clicked with tiny, precise sounds as if measuring my pulse by sympathy. The air inside tasted like iron and old paper. My hearing had become absurd. I could hear the hum of the device as if it were a living thing breathing at my wrist. They asked me to sit on a stool. The seat was plain, no padding, and the wood had impressions of others' thighs, of knees played against in long waits. "Eyes open," said the lead examiner. His voice was even professional, a metal thing shaped into a human word. He kept his gloved hands folded. The wax sigil on my forehead had set into a thin, dark relief, like a scar that did not hurt but did not belong. When the examiner finally leaned close, he did not speak to me so much as inspect me. His gaze traveled the way a surgeon might survey a wound he will not touch. Cataloging, indifferent, searching for fault lines. They turned on an instrument I had never seen before. It hummed in 3 registers and painted the air with a fine static that made the hair at the back of my neck stand up. When it reached for me, I felt an almost tangible pull at the edges of my thoughts. Nothing like hands, more like tugs at the corners of a blanket. The world tightened. The candle wax smelled stronger, and the song of the kettle from the barracks became a brass trumpet which I could pick out and follow like a thread. My mouth filled with the taste of pennies and raw grain. The device's glass caught my eye and held a small, wavering reflection. My face, pale and astonished. They spoke to each other in clipped sentences I could only half hear. Technical names were tossed like coins between them. "Reaction is acute," one said. "Threshold variance." Each phrase felt like a note in a score that I had not learned. I was measured in breaths and in the soft scrape of the stool against the stone floor. The examiners traced sigils in the air with gloved fingertips, the gestures ritualistic, calm, practiced. The motions had the grace of someone who had performed them until the danger of the action had long ago been contained. I tried to anchor myself on small things. I thought of bread baking at my mother's stall, thick smoke and flour under thumb. I thought of a laugh that had once rent the day open, fingers of memory like thin ropes. My mind, for all the strain, could still find them. Sometimes that would be enough. Sometimes it would not. The pull grew. It was not violent so much as insistent, like a tide rising at the feet of a house. My skin prickled, the room's sounds unstitched and restitched into patterns that suggested voices where there were none. For a moment I heard a child cry that was not in the hall. For a moment I smelled salt and dirt and a sea I had never seen. Something shifted then. A tiny release followed by a sudden heat behind my eyes. It felt like standing too close to a forge and not being burned, only scorched by possibility. There was a noise that was almost a voice and almost a machine, and in that instant my thoughts slipped. A picture flashed. No, not mine. A memory wrapped in someone else's sorrow. A field under a blue sky, hands reaching, someone calling a name I did not know. The candle flames wavered as if a breeze had moved through the room, though every window was shut. My knees pressed hard into the stool. I clenched my teeth to keep the picture from blooming. The lead examiner's hand came down, gentle but firm, on my shoulder. "Focus," he said. The single word landed with enormous weight. I wanted to tell him that I was trying, that trying felt like holding onto a rope made of water, but breath came out as a laugh I did not want. Instead, I thought of the bread again. The smell steadied me. The image of my mother's hands, calloused and honest, filled my chest like ballast. Thoughts that were not my own receded like animals frightened by light. The brass and glass device clicked and shivered. The lead examiner stepped back and consulted a ledger with a pencil that seemed too heavy for his paper. "Runes stable," he murmured. And for the first time there was a trace of interest in his voice instead of mere duty. The other examiner tilted his head, listening to something the rest of us could not hear, his gloved thumb tapping the edge of the table in a nervous little rhythm. Around us, the hall moved in its slow machinery. A kettle finally fell silent, a door closed somewhere, footsteps that belonged to a life that would go on whether or not I survived this morning. They asked me questions after that, not about doctrine or lineage, not about loyalty or whom I prayed to. They wanted sensations. "What color is the noise?" one asked, and it was absurd and terrifying to have to put a color to the way the warp hummed. I told them it was a black that had edges of copper like a burnt coin. They took notes. I told them of the child's cry and the blue field. They made faces that were not unkind, but they were careful faces. The faces of people who measure heat with instruments and measure souls with their eyes. When the initial session wound down, they did not send me back to the barracks. The sergeant from earlier returned, his face set in that same granite expression, and led me through a second set of doors that smelled only of stone and old oil. The light thinned. The candles behind us seemed suddenly distant, like stars receding as the earth turned. I realized I had not thought in a long time of what it meant if I failed. The thought sat in my stomach like a pebble. Everyone around me had reasons they could not afford to be taken. Mother's brother's debt. I had reasons too. But the thing that most haunted me as we walked was simple and bitter. The loss of small, ordinary things that made life tolerable. The sergeant's hand on my elbow was not gentle. It was steady, necessary. He marched me forward without spectacle, but with a purpose that felt like a gate closing behind me. "You will either learn to keep it shut or you will learn to be a weapon," he said, not unkindly. The words were not a threat. They were a ledger entry. I swallowed. My mouth tasted of wax and iron and an old fear that had been warmed into something sharper. Ahead of us was a door of dark iron, inset with a narrow window that offered only a slit of light. Beyond it was a room I had only half expected to enter. The sergeant set his palm against the cold metal and pushed. The hinges protested, then opened. Air from the other side washed over me, cool, dry, like a different climate. The examiners stepped forward, masks returning to faces I could not quite read. The device hummed a lower note. There was no ceremony, no laurels. Only the steady beat of people doing what they had been taught to do. Separate the useful from the ruinous. Learn which minds could be guided and which would have to be contained. I had been dragged from the muster for testing, and everything that followed was small decisions strung together. To hold on to a memory, to name a color to a noise, to keep my knees from buckling. I thought then, as the door swung wider, that I could not afford to be either a ruin or a weapon without choosing to be so. The hall behind me shrank to a thinned map, and the room ahead opened with the sort of silence that announces a new law of things. I stepped forward because the alternative felt like letting the tide take me without a rope. My hand clenched on the edge of the stool as if on a lifeline. I intended to meet whatever they put before me with what little control I had left. They hauled me down a corridor that smelled like wet stone and machine oil, their boots a percussion beneath my ribs. The light changed from the muffled yellow of the muster to a hard white that tasted of ozone. It made shadows fall wrong across my hands. They sat me on a slab that hummed faintly, and a woman with a badge from the Adeptus Astra Telepathica fitted a band of cold metal around my temples. Her voice was the voice of procedure, no softness, no malice, only the flat orders that make obedience easier. I let my breath slow to the metronome of the room and tried, stupidly, to convince myself that it was merely testing. At the first swell of the device, I felt the world slip like a loose thread. The room became a glass globe that flexed and breathed. The hum grew sharp as a blade. One of the attendants, lean and quick with a null rod, ran its length along the rail beside me, and the air clamped down, muffling the edges of panic. The rod was a black rod of iron in theory, cold against the skin when they pressed it into my palm during calibration. I watched the shivers travel up the hands of those around me when the null field came alive. They called it safety. I called it pressure. They began with the small things first, as if coaxing a wild animal out of its den. Words, numbers, images, simple anchors they asked me to hold. "Remember your name," the woman said. "Think of the number 3. Each command felt like a finger in the seam of my skull. I conjured the shape of my name and found it full of barbs. The number 3 rotated into a wheel of knives. Then the world fell away and I saw a courtyard I had not visited in years. Cracked tiles, a rusted pail, a woman humming with flour on her hands. The vision was warm and absurd in that stark room. The text readouts spiked. A small man in goggles murmured into a recorder and the band tightened. They wanted control. Their instruments demanded neat things. Can you bring forth the memory on command? Can you banish it when I tell you? Can you reach into an empty box and fetch a number? Each attempt was a dialogue with something that did not obey me. Sometimes it answered in pictures, sometimes in noise. Once when they asked me to find an image of a chair, I saw a galaxy like a bowl of spilled pearls. My mouth went dry. The woman with the badge clicked her tongue and wrote something I could not read. The null rod glowed faintly at her side, as if to insist that whatever I was, it would be measured and weighed. They probed not only with machines, but with touch. A gloved hand hovered near my temple, and I could feel the air between us thicken, like walking through damp wool. When that hand touched my brow, a bell rang somewhere in my chest. The sound was not auditory. It was a sequence of consequences that rolled through me. Memories folding like paper, the smell of oil, the scrape of a spoon on enamel. The attendant's eyes flicked toward the readout and widened. "Echo," he said softly, the word a small verdict. Someone else muttered a classification. I did not know whether to be afraid of the word or of the way they looked at me when they said it. At one point, they asked me to make a light move. A single wax flame sat in its bowl on a tray across the room. The examiner, an older man with a face like a ledger, leaned in and said nothing. He told me simply to imagine the flame leaning toward him. I concentrated until my head was a stone and the room narrowed to the size of a matchbox. The flame wavered. It caught subtly as if listening. Two of the attendants glanced at each other, fingers tightened on instruments. The flame did not leap into a grand gesture. It only folded its little body in a way that read like a scent. That small obedience was enough to sharpen every face into interest. The ledger-faced man smiled like someone who finds a missing page. They wanted data. They wanted lines on a graph that would put me into a column with a stamp and a fate. They fed me images and cataloged my reactions. They put a mask over my mouth and asked me to name colors until the colors scraped my teeth raw. In the gaps between their questions, I caught the scent of laundry drifting from a corridor, the most ordinary thing, and it calmed the savage part of me. For a breath, I felt human in a room full of instruments that preferred numbers. Then the calibration shifted. The instruments hungrily extended into things that did not have neat answers. Someone brought in an object enclosed in glass, a shard of a reliquary that hummed like a heart. They asked me what it meant. What it meant was a child under a black sky counting stars until sleep lifted its eyelids. In front of the glass, the room bent like heat above tar. My voice came out small. I told them, and the ledger-faced man nodded, and the woman from the Astra Telepathica took a sip of something that looked like coffee and did not drink it. They spoke softly beyond the glass, arranging consequences, shifting pronouns of ownership and duty. I learned the way buildings can lean toward you when you are weighed as property. Potential was the word that slid through the hatch of conversation and stuck in my mouth. The weight of that little syllable pressed on my throat with a future the size of a ledger. There was a point where the walls began to record my failures more than my triumphs. A technician asked me to take another memory and fold it smaller, to make it lie still on command. I tried. The memory seethed like oil under water and would not sit flat. The circuit of faces around me changed then. Compassion was replaced by a catalogarian's detachment. One of them, a young woman with a scar tracing her jaw, leaned so close I could see the ridges of her breath fogging the air. She reached into my mind like a thief, and I was suddenly ashamed of every thought I had ever had. She pulled out a filament thin as thread and held it up for the others to see. "Empathic bleed," she whispered. Another scribble on the recorder. The band around my head hummed and tightened as if to hold the leaks. I touched someone's mind without meaning to. A hand had brushed mine as they checked the rod, and the world shuddered, revealing private inventory, grocery lists, children's names, the scent of bleach on an apron. The intimacy of it made me flinch. The ledger-faced man watched my hands nervously. "Can you close that?" he asked, not unkindly. "Please." Closing it felt like strangling a sob inside me. I made then a deliberate effort to fold the parts away, the simple domestic things, the humiliations, and found myself staring at a dark corridor instead, not mine, but full of the sound of marching. They took that as a sign. "Trail," the woman from Astra Telepathica said, and her finger traced leaden lines across a hollow map. "A strong trail," she added. The technicians conferred in short bursts, a machine language stitched into human speech. Somewhere beyond the doors, people were preparing lists and ships in legal jargon. The ledger-faced man excused himself to send a message. When he left his chair, he was not the same as when he had sat down. The way he moved had acquired a seriousness I did not like. I imagined for the first time the thing they did to those who could not be contained. The image was a black ship slicing the sky and a waiting room full of faces with no futures. I swallowed hard and tasted metal. Fear made me stupid and then cunning in quick succession. I tried to bargain silently with that other thing inside me, the electric spark that answered to my grief and anger. Don't flare, I told it. Don't give them sentences to write in red ink. Give them nothing but the smallest coin. But control was a muscle I had not exercised. It trembled. In that tremor, a sliver of something else slipped out and touched the ledger-faced man's mind with a question he never asked aloud. What if you cannot cage what you do not understand? The man jerked as if someone had moved his chair from under him. He recovered quickly and returned, a professional, a folder thicker now in his hands. They read me then, more than asked. I was catalogued and weighed, my finer threads noted and folded into files. They spoke of options, containment, training, transfer. The words were bureaucratic gloves over knives. I watched the woman with the badge mark something on a slate and then look up at me with an expression I couldn't parse. It might have been pity. It might have been calculation. The ledger-faced man cleared his throat and said, with the calm of someone who delivers sentences, that there would be a recommendation to move me to a facility where they could teach me to use what I had. The hallway beyond the testing room seemed to lean toward us, full of new doors. I felt the horizon pull taut around a single decision, whether to let them lead me by the wrist down that corridor into training and chains of one kind or another, or to make of the thing inside me a weapon to carve a different path. The options were not noble. They were survival in two languages. I tasted ash and old bread, and the possibility of leaving the room walking free was as thin as a rumor. The woman from Astra Telepathica folded the slate and said almost gently that a transport would be arranged within the hour. The ledger-faced man rose again, his shadow falling over my legs. I sat up from the slab, the metal cool beneath my palms, and felt the hum of my own blood answering the machines. Outside, beyond the sealed door, voices gathered like migrating birds. Inside, the instruments cooled. I flexed my fingers and felt the slight pull of the null rod in my jacket pocket, a tether and a promise. I had minutes perhaps before the decision became a form to sign and a berth to board. The room waited like an audience. I decided to stand. My knees were jelly, but my spine held, and as they led me from the slab, I made myself imagine not the ledger or the ship, but the courtyard with the rusted pail and the woman humming. If I was going to be moved, then I would move with something of myself intact. They fastened a cuff around my wrist, and the ledger-faced man offered a single question as if it might count for something. "Are you ready?" he asked. I inhaled, and the answer came from a place that had been silent all day. I did not know what readiness meant, but I did not want to be taken without it. The straps bit into my chest, and the room narrowed to a ring of white light and the smell of oil. A technician leaned over me with a slate and a pen, his face flattened by the reflection of the screens. He did not speak like a man comforting a frightened child. He asked questions like a machine, then recorded the answers as if they were parts to be assembled elsewhere. I answered because the air left me when I did not. They clipped a sensor to my temples. Cold metal kissed my skin and clung, a modest thing that felt like an accusation. Somewhere in the room a generator thrummed, a low heartbeat that matched my own until I could not tell which was real. The technician's voice went away and something else pushed at the inside of my head. Not a voice, but footsteps in a corridor I had never walked. I inhaled, and the corridor stepped closer. The first test was simple. "Look at the candle," they said. "Tell us what you see." I could smell wax and smoke that were not there. The candle burned in a language that hissed and rearranged itself into names. The man with the slate watched my pupils for a twitch, my jaw for a tremor. I focused on the wick, on the human mechanics of flame, and tried to keep my thoughts shallow, like stones skipping the surface of a dark pond. But the pond had mouths. They introduced the needle later. It was a fine thing, thin as worry, and they told me it would prick the web of the mind and map the pull. I saw the needle approach as a line of salt that dissolved the edges of the ceiling. I thought, absurdly, that if I concentrated on how the needle looked, I could keep the rest of the world from breaking into glances and whispers. It touched my wrist, and the room smelled suddenly of rain on baked earth. The technician fumbled a dial. The screen blossomed with noise. Spikes and troughs like a distant mountain range recorded under glass. Someone in a corner muttered, "Heteri reading stabilized," and I realized they were speaking to a console rather than to me. The second test was the listening. They instructed me to accept sounds that were not broadcast. I lay with my eyes shut and waited for the room to tell its secrets. At first there was only the hum and the technician's clipped breath. Then the wall exhaled the sound of someone running through dry leaves. A child's laugh unspooled beneath it and made my teeth ache. The laugh folded into a shape like a coin, and I could feel its edges. I tried to find it without touching it, to trace its rim with the tip of my mind and learn whether it was friend or hunger. The laugh jolted as if startled by my interest and fled into something older. They brought in the minder for the endurance trials. He was a compact man with blank eyes and the kind of silence that sat like a shield. His name was said once like an instruction, and then he became only a presence at my shoulder. He never spoke unless a bell rang. When he moved his hand, it smelled faintly of burned paper. I watched him as if watching a tide and realized that in watching I was giving him power. That small knowledge felt like safety and like guilt all at once. The minders taught me restraint with tools that were not physical. They trained my breathing to precise intervals, in for 4, hold for 7, out for 8, until the memory of the pattern wrapped itself into my muscles. When the pressure came, the pattern anchored me. Pressure came as it always did, as a crowd that had nothing to say but made its presence felt by leaning. I imagined a door with an old, rusted lock. Each breath turned the key slowly and the lock resisted. Then, with a sound like a sigh from far away, the bolt released a fraction and something cold and dry stepped inside my skull. They tested me for influence by sending in others to stand near. A boy with 2 large hands watched me as if measuring. A woman with a voice like gravel hummed nursery rhymes through her teeth. They stood near and said nothing but made my thoughts small. The minder watched the monitors and tapped commands into a wrist device that hummed. When the pressure rose, I focused on the taste of metal that filled my mouth. It was an anchor I had learned to hold. The room roared, but the anchor tasted steady. I clung to it until the roar lessened, until the monitors calmed, until the minder's eyes found mine and gave me the faintest nod. They did not tell me everything. You learn to read what they withheld. A pause in a technician's movement could mean congratulations or a verdict. The minder never smiled. When the lead examiner arrived, he wore a cloak that smelled of cold stone and the spare, disciplined air of someone who had to make decisions without feeling. He tapped a screen and asked a vocabulary question that was really a trap. He wanted me to reach, to touch the coin of a thought and not return it intact. I refused because refusing had saved me before. Refusal made a person small in a room full of hungry eyes, but it kept the worst of the voices at bay. An alarm blinked once, then twice. The examiners moved like a school of fish. One direction mattered and all followed. I felt my heart jump without knowing why. The minder's hand tightened around his tablet. Someone wheeled in a cylinder of glass and metal. Its purpose was obvious to everyone in the room except me. They called it a sieve in a tone that made the word look like a tool, not a threat. The sight of it made my skin prickle. I had heard stories, of course, in the square at the muster when they passed through village lanes. But stories are softer than the real thing, like cloth compared to steel. They asked me to put my hands inside the sieve. The circle where the metal met my skin was cooler than the rest of the instrument. Inside, the air tasted of letters and distant storms. They switched on the machine slowly, as if coaxing a reluctant animal. The room filled with a steady, low chitter that made my teeth feel like loose stones. Images bled at the edges of my mind. A field of upturned faces, a ship's bulkhead bending like a thought, and a child's feet running into fog. I reached for one as a drowning man reaches for a rope and felt a hand. Not a hand from the room, but from somewhere beyond the hum. Press back. The minder's voice came through a speaker near my ear. Count, he said. Numbers only. 1 to 10, slow. No images. I counted like a ritual, each number a step away from the noise. The sieve spat and coughed and wrote lines across the screen. The lead examiner's lips moved, spelling out a theorem I could not hear. When the machine stopped, they recorded a series of numbers that looked like a map. They did not smile. My wrists were damp and the candle of my patience guttered. After the sieve, they tried to prod me into control. They showed me a bird in a cage and asked me to still it with thought. I had practiced stopping flies with a gaze until I could feel the pulsing of their wings. Commanding a living thing felt like commanding my own breath. The bird did not obey at first. It fluttered and peered and sang with the foolish arrogance of life. Then when I willed it even a little, the bird stilled. The room held its breath like a casket. The lead examiner tapped his pen. Potential, he said, the word of verdict dressed in neutral tone. Potential was a dangerous thing. It meant weight, and with weight came decision. They did not ask me what I wanted. No one ever asked. They only catalogued and ranked and measured. At midnight, they brought in a fresh dish of bread and salt and told me to eat. The bread was still warm and it tasted like home because the oven had remembered how to make crust. They watched me chew, noting cadence and swallow like a ritual inspection. Afterward, the minder led me down a corridor that smelled of iron and lemon. Fluorescent lamps hummed overhead like distant insects. We walked in silence until we reached a door with a small viewport and a red light that pulsed with slow patience. Inside the next room, the light was softer. A woman sat at a table with a stack of paper and a pen that scuffed the paper as if elated to be useful. Her hair was streaked with gray. She looked at me not as a specimen, but as a ledger entry kept in a lover's hand. "They'll transfer you soon," she said without looking up. Her voice was not cruel. It did not gloat. It simply stated that the next step was already decided. That knowledge settled over me like dust and made the edges of my intentions shimmer. "I don't know if I can," I said. The words came out more honest than I wanted. The woman smiled a small, unreadable smile and pushed a paper toward me. "You don't have to know yet," she said. "You only have to understand why they want you." Her finger tapped a line, brief and precise. For a moment I thought I saw the word sanction written there. The paper smelled of soap and ink. Her eyes met mine and held, steady as the face of a clock. They walked me back to the cell and left the light low. The minder closed the door with a sound like a judgment. I lay on the narrow cot and counted the sound of the building settling, the same pattern I'd used in the sieve. My mind wandered like a bird in a cage, pecking at the bars. Outside my window, the world continued in its small cruelties and mercies. Someone laughed, a cartwheel complained, a dog bayed. Inside, other noises braided into my sleep, not the comfortable noises of a city, but tighter, sharper things like thought threads rubbing one another. When I woke, the minder had already prepared my things. He handed me a thin cloak and a small satchel. "Pack light," he said. His voice had the shape of someone relaying a summons. He did not offer hope. He did not offer consolation. He offered logistics, and that was itself a kind of language I had come to recognize. Outside in the corridor, the air felt colder. The lead examiner stood waiting with a slate. He handed it to me and pointed to a line that named a destination I did not yet understand. A place where minds were kept and taught, or broken and sold. He tapped the line with a stylus. "You leave at dawn," he said. "Prepare yourself." I looked at the cloak, at the satchel, at my hands. The satchel contained a few rations, a small flint, and the map of a road I had never walked. My palms were raw with the memory of the sieve, my head full of small, impossible pictures. Somewhere behind the examiner, the city whispered like old fabric being folded. I had been dragged from muster and tested, measured and poked, and in return they had issued me directions. I could feel the pull of the road before I stepped onto it, as if the future were a gravity well that began with a single footfall. I folded the cloak about my shoulders and set my jaw. The minder fell into step beside me, and together we left the building that had listened to my thoughts and decided what might become of them. The clamp at my temple bit colder than the metal had any right to be. It smelled faintly of oil and burned cloth. A rhythm of clicks and whirs marched behind my ears, servo motors and instruments tuning themselves to me. I tried to count the clicks to steady my breath, but the clicks counted themselves instead, folding into the background like a chorus returning to its part. My mouth tasted of iron. My hands were folded beneath the strap across my chest, fingers cramped but empty of anything to hold. Someone spoke my name then, and the sound snapped like a thin wire. It was not a voice I knew. It had the even flatness of someone who had never been surprised. "Subject ready," the voice said. I answered with nothing. My throat felt thick and slow, as if some animal were trying to pass through it. The voice repeated a name I had known once, more a label than me, and the room leaned in. Light pressed at the back of my lids, not one color but pressure. Like water pressing against skin until the skin found a new shape. Images boiled up that belonged to no memory. Corridors that tasted of ash. A child laughing under a sky that was all flame. Hands. Other hands, reaching and not finding anything to settle. I clenched my jaw, and the clamp sent a pulse of cold into the base of my skull. The pulse was not pain. It was measurement translated into sensation. A man beside me adjusted a dial. He wore cloth and brass on his forearms and the calloused hands of someone who had learned to steady tremors with tools. He did not look at me when he spoke. "Focus on the candle in front of you," he said. The candle was not there. The instruction was a hinge. I tried to imagine a flame small enough to keep on my tongue. It sputtered into ashes that smelled like the chapel back home, and the ashes arranged themselves into a face I almost recognized. A scream. That was my own image of a scream, rearranged into a tone perfectly tuned to the instruments. The sensors on either side of my head registered it, numbers flashing briefly on a strip of glass. The man nodded to someone farther in the room, someone whose silhouette smelled of ozone and old prayers. A card clattered. Steps moved like a metronome. Each footfall made something in the back of my head itch, like dry grass being stroked from right to left. They wanted to know how loud I was. They wanted to know how far my reach could stretch and how jagged the edges were. They fed me small doors to open and watched what crawled out. The first door was an image of my mother's hands, palms working dough until the seams of her fingers were almost transparent. For a second, I could smell yeast and hot fat. Then the hands slipped away and the door swung open on a corridor inside me I had never explored. There were other doors, and each one had someone waiting, a memory I hadn't owned, a face I had not seen in my years, all pressing to be recognized. You learn quickly in rooms like that how to bargain with your own mind. I made little trades, a lie for a quieter door, a truth for a lesser pain. The machine took what it wanted anyway. There were moments when the world outside the clamp seemed to fall away, colors draining to the wrong wavelength, the man in brass becoming lines and then an idea of a man. In those slivers, the noise behind my ribs rose up like a second heartbeat. It carried shapes that felt ancient, like language before language, and they wanted names. A thin woman with a voice like gravel leaned close. She asked me about God. The question was not theological. She meant the emperors of systems and the names given to stars. She was mapping where my allegiance, accidental as it might be, might fall. I kept my answers small. I had been taught to pray for simple things: bread, shelter, the quieting of bad dreams. The woman tapped a hollow note into a recorder. Her eyes did not shift to me, they were set on the instrument's readout, where my inner storms made patterns like flocking birds. Sometimes the test would give me a puzzle that tasted like childhood, a kite on a windy day, a father's hand on my shoulder, small everyday anchors that were supposed to hold me. When the anchor worked, the clamps warmed and the whirring softened, as if the machine approved. When the anchor failed, it asked louder questions. I felt the test searching me for a spark it could not contain, a brightness that might leak like a fault. Every time my mind skirted that brightness, the room tightened around me. Once, while they pushed, something in the wall of my memory broke its seam and let through a voice that was not my own. It did not speak words. It transmitted heat, the weather of a place I had never been. The voice wanted me to look at it and be small, to dissolve the edges I had learned to keep. I gripped the strap until my knuckles hurt to keep from answering. The strap offered no comfort. It was a reminder that other hands had decided I could be measured and that their measure might not be kind. The man in brass muttered something about resonance. They called it that, resonance, and measured it as if it were a substance you could sieve and weigh. My resonance, when they finally charted it, looked like a mountain cut sideways, jagged and folding on itself. They frowned at that. The woman with gravel in her voice tapped her lip and then sent for someone else. They brought a book. It was a thin bound thing with pages that smelled of library dust and incense. The book contained lists, names, conditions, rituals. It had a hard edge to it, and someone ran their finger down a list until it stopped at my name. The finger belonged to someone who spoke authority without raising their voice. They told me very simply what the lists meant. They said there were only a few paths for those with the kind of glow the machine measured. One path meant service, sanctioning, a harness of rituals, a regiment of training that would take my nights and make them predictable. The other path, if I failed or resisted, meant erasure, or worse, a rechanneling that would let others feed off what I could not keep for myself. Words like sanction and harness should have rung like church bells. They did not. The more immediate sound was the breath in my ears and the distant clack of footsteps crossing stone. I asked what sanction felt like. The man in brass looked at me as if I had asked what a storm felt like to a stone. Safety, usually, he said, and then he smiled with the tiredness of someone who had broken more things than he had fixed. Safety was a word wrapped in wire and confession. Safety meant my freedom bent to their reasons. They left instructions with me. Small things. Stay away from crowds where voices mixed. Learn to hide a thought in the seam of a sentence. Eat sparingly when your head began to hum because hunger made the hum worse. They gave me a shard of a holy relic to wear, a small disc cold against the skin. It vibrated faintly when I was alone, a tiny beat to remind me there was an order larger than my fear. I fastened it to the inside of my collar and pretended it was warm. Even with a shard against my chest, loneliness grew like moss. Nights in the cells of processing halls ate at the edges of my sanity. There was always light, steps, doors opening, the distant hum of machinery. Sleep came in lapses where I could not tell whether a dream belonged to me or the machine. When I tried to sleep for real, the other voices came, those that had trailed me since the muster, the echo children of the initial draft, the ones I had learned to drown out with counting. In those hours, I'd press my forehead to the cold wall and whisper to no one, bargaining with the dark for a way to keep my mind mine. Words seeped through eventually, rumors handed over a turned corner by someone who had once been a child like me. They said the sanctioned were taken to halls where men and women were taught to wear their light like armor. They learned discipline in their thoughts. They practiced shaping small things, raising a flicker of heat, moving a drop of water. They were given names and ranks. They were useful, the rumor went, and the usefulness kept the more dangerous things at bay. The unsanctioned? That rumor had a quieter end. The unsanctioned were removed from muster lists. They vanished from local memory. People pretended they had never existed. The idea of being useful made me uneasy and hungry at once. Useful meant being needed. Used meant being spent. I had never been needed without being consumed. There was a memory, one of those doors they had opened during testing, of my village's generator on a cold night, of me lifting a small current until the lights flickered and a child laughed. The laugh had felt like being anchored, and I reached for it now like someone reaching for a rope across a river. Usefulness glinted like a promise. They came for decisions toward the end of the day. The room smelled of brewed rations and old devotions. The man in brass folded his hands and spoke without hurry. He told me my options as if listing weather changes. He said the word sanction again and laid out the conditions: transport to a training facility, daily rituals, oversight until my gifts were steady. He said the word erasure with less ceremony. It was a small word that carried a big shadow. He watched my face for a reaction. His watch showed a time that meant nothing to me. Something in me, the part that had learned to read the small cues between people, noticed the way his hand lingered near the register of names. There were other registers, I suspected, that did not get shown to newcomers. The test had already told them things about me before I could answer, a shape they could weigh. I felt exposed, raw as a bare nail. I tried bargaining one last time. I asked for a sliver of autonomy. Work to do that was not merely obedience. A chance to learn on my terms. A teacher who would let questions remain unpunished. The man in brass tilted his head and considered. He told me the sanction did not get to choose every teacher. He said that training had procedures. He said safety was a collective matter. His eyes flicked to the gravel-voiced woman, and her pen paused like a held blade. When I could not bargain for freedom, I tried bargaining for memory. If I go, I said, voice raw, then let me keep some mornings at least. Let me keep the smell of yeast in my mother's hands. The man in brass moved, and for a second his face was no longer the flat cast of his role. He smiled small and tired and said a thing that became a new kind of contract. Memories were not commodities the sanctioned promised to preserve. They would be circled, cataloged, and if a memory threatened training, it might be replaced. He said it gently, as if explaining why the sky was sometimes not blue. The choice was not presented as a choice. It was given to me like a road laid before a cart with a single pair of oxen. If I refused, someone would cut the path or bar it. If I accepted, I would be harnessed and taught to turn the brightness into a tool that could be wielded on distant battlefields. In either eventuality, someone else decided the price. I thought about running. That idea arrived like a small animal, quick and cold-toothed. There was a map in my head, faint and worn by doubt, of narrow alleys and the river outside the processing hall, of trains leaving toward places the sanctioned trained. The map felt possible for one breath. The next breath returned to the clamps and the watchful eyes. Escape required more than legs. It required the absence of them noticing. I had noticed already. They unfastened the clamp at last. It clicked away like a promise broken. My head was a ragged scab of sensations, each pull reminding me I had not been whole when they started. I sat up and my limbs felt foreign. The room hummed on, indifferent. The man in brass folded the thin book closed and set it aside. He looked at me as if a private weight belonged to him now too. "You'll be processed for sanction tomorrow," he said. No uplift, no curse, just a statement. The gravel-voiced woman handed me a thin cup of water. It tasted ordinary and excellent. I drank until the cold slid down my throat and the hum in my ears settled to something like a steady drum. My hands shook less after the water. When they led me back through corridors that smelled of old iron, other candidates pressed against bars and watched. Some faces were hard with resolve, others were pale as cloth. I met one gaze, a boy whose collar had not yet been stamped with the sanctioned mark, and for a moment we both understood the ledger we had been placed in. He mouthed a question. I could not tell whether it was hope or accusation. By the exit, the man in brass stopped. He turned, and for the first time since the clamp, he met my eyes directly. "One thing," he said. "When they train you, they will ask you to name the thing you are afraid of most. Be careful how you answer. People shape you around your fear." He let the sentence hang like a tool on a hook and then added quieter, "It can be used as well as it can be a wound." I had thought I knew the shape of my fear. I followed the path he indicated back into the light and felt the old questions line up behind me. The ones about surrender and survival, about whether to choose the harness or to let them choose to silence me. A train leapt somewhere across the city, a sound that signified movement. For the first time in a long stretch of days, I imagined not only leaving but taking something with me. A memory, a fragment of flame small enough to keep. My feet carried me forward, and my mind, against the insistence of the clamps and the registers, made a decision I did not voice out loud.